Good afternoon. Welcome back. Can you hear me? So in the afternoon session, we're going to embark on two conversations between theorists and practitioners. And we're going to perhaps have finally something unexpected. We're going to experiment a little bit with the format. Bülent Diken, who I'll introduce in just a minute, is going to speak first. And then Wouter Vanstiphout will speak. And then we will engage in a conversation that is open to the audience. So we encourage you to ask questions. Bülent Diken teaches social and cultural theory at the Department of Sociology in Lancaster University in Lancaster. He studied urban planning at the Aarhus School of Architecture, Aarhus in Denmark, and previously taught at the Institute of Geography, Roskilde University in Roskilde. Diken's research includes social theory, post-structuralism, political philosophy, urban sociology, and immigration. He's currently working on two book projects, Revolt, Revolution, Critique, The Paradox of Society, and the second book, The Sociology of Terrorism. Recent publications include Nihilism in 2009 and Strangers, Ambivalence and Social Theory in 1998. Together with Karsten Bagge-Lausten, he has authored the books Sociology Through the Projector, The Culture of Exception, Sociology Facing the Camp, and you'll have to pronounce it for me, I terrorens skige in 2004. Diken lives and works in Lancaster. And the floor is yours, Bülent.
Thank you. Well, it's as it is obvious from my CV. Should I take that?
Maybe that's better, yeah.
Good. I kind of academically grew up in a school of architecture, where I was really annoyed by the convention of lectures in the School of Architecture. Namely, people would never give prepared presentations, but they would just converse. And here I am. Now I have to do exactly what I escaped from 15 years ago. Perhaps on this occasion I could give the organizers a secret. Actually, academics hate to converse. If you really want to annoy an academic, for instance, just go to him right before his presentation and take his paper from him. He will shatter. This is, of course, because the written paper is a fetish object for the academic. It's what defines his identity, his being right at the moment. But there are also other reasons, I think. So it probably, I would like to link that to the topic of conversation. I have an ambiguous feeling with the word conversation. I think it could mean two things immediately. One, dialogue, and second, it could mean perhaps, I would like it to mean it, kind of improvisation, which I would like to link to the idea of communism if I have time. But first, dialogue. It's no coincidence that a lot of philosophers, a lot of social scientists do not like the idea of dialogue. Deleuze, for instance, even said that as soon as a philosopher comes to me and says, let's debate this matter, I will jump from my chair and run as far as possible. Because philosophy is not about dialogue for Deleuze. Badiou would say the same. Philosophy is an axiomatic solo pursuit. You do it alone. It's not necessarily a democratic intervention. So also sociology would be suspicious of conversation. For instance, somebody like Pierre Bourdieu would say, you know, academic thought is about going as close as possible to the people, converse with them, but immediately after one needs to step out and objectify, participate in an objectivating way. So that's what he would call praxeology. It's against conversation again. Or Zygmunt Bauman would say, you know, now we live in a liquid modern society. Forget all about all those old-fashioned lectures. You have to do it quickly, like in a talk show, in a hit-and-run fashion. Deliver what you have to say in 5 minutes and leave. That's the liquid modern type of conference, which is perhaps in preparation. Or Boltanski would say, we increasingly live in a new kind of network capitalism in which artistic ambitions coincide with productivity and marketability. So we are expected to be creative. He even calls this artist capitalism. In artist capitalism, what is not desirable is, of course, long, boring, old-fashioned lectures, but more entertaining, smaller, shorter, quicker conversations again. Or Zizek would say, you know, conversation, to say converse to an academic is actually a paradoxical pursuit, because by doing this you are turning freedom into an imperative. When you say to people, be creative, be free, it becomes a burden. Not everybody can answer this demand, which is precisely the superego demand. So it's not easy to converse. A lot of academics, a lot of philosophers, sociologists would directly, outright oppose this replacement of conversation with lecture, I guess. But I would like to be more friendly. I would like to think with the desire for conversation rather than lecture. Anyway, I think I got an idea yesterday, which relates to the idea of communism. If one would like to, I think I agree with the previous notion of communism as something to come. Communism is a virtual idea. It cannot be fully actualized. It's always valuable, desirable as something to come. As soon as you say this is communism, you kill the idea of communism. This is the kind of understanding of communism in contemporary transcendence philosophy of transcendence, which I find very useful. But there is one thing I thought: communism is always to come. I agree with this, but also there is a kind of ontological communism that already has been there. This could probably be linked to the idea of the commons, or many other options are there. But I would like to, for instance, argue that there exists a common notion of communism in practical life. I think, for instance, jazz as a kind of music is a kind of realization of communism. Communism has not been realized as a political idea, but it has been realized as an aesthetic idea. If you think with Marx and Engels' definition of communism as the coincidence of individual liberty, individual freedom, and collective equality, you find precisely this in jazz music. You have to be able to play your instrument alone, you have to be able to do your solo, but you have to listen to the other. You have to be able to function in the collective. So this is, I think, a kind of ontological communism. Especially you find this in experimental jazz, free jazz, which takes this idea of improvisation to the extremes, which is why Louis Armstrong himself said experimental jazz is an evil one. But my point is, taken as a kind of ontological communism, the idea of conversation or improvisation might be a challenging but very useful idea at the same time. Against this basis, I thought what can I say about this topic without preparation? What common problem aesthetics and politics have today? This is what I kind of would like to say a few things about. But can I talk 5, 6, 10 more minutes? Sure.
Can I just 1 second? Actually, Bülent, it's the conversations are the most generous in terms of the time that we have. We have an hour and a half, so you should feel free to improvise freely as long as you need to. And when we're ready to open up the conversation,
that's my point.
we will.
You need the solo.
Okay, this is the solo, and the next instrument, Wouter Vanstiphout, will add his harmony soon.
Okay, thank you. The common problem, I think, which both aesthetics and politics need to confront today, can be summarized closer. Okay. It could be summarized in one word, perhaps. I would say biopolitics. I think that's the crux of all the problems which are already mentioned both yesterday and today. And this is a very old problem. Recently, I watched Stanley Kubrick's film Spartacus. In Spartacus, the Roman general fighting Spartacus talks to somebody else at one point. He says, the point of the Spartacus war is not to kill Spartacus, the slave. The point is to kill the legend of Spartacus, the specter. So already in the figure of Spartacus, the first revolting slave, the slave and the specter coincide. This coincidence is exactly what somebody like Agamben would call exception. In the figure of Spartacus, in the exceptional figure of Spartacus, this biopolitical coincidence of the specter and slave takes place. And we live with this coincidence. Every time we go to an airport, we are reduced to biological bodies in order to go through the security systems which recognize you only as naked bodies. You are a biopolitical subject. At the same time, you are nothing without your passport. You are a true specter at once. Because without your passport, you won't even be able to exist in an airport. You are both a specter and a biopolitical subject, a naked body, basically. This is, I think, the contemporary problem. The ideological concept, the most suitable ideological concept for this could be, there are, of course, many competing concepts like post-politics or post-democracy like Rancière's, but I like Badiou's concept, democratic materialism, which suits me much better. Democratic materialism, Badiou says, can be summarized in one single maxim. There are only bodies and languages. Only bodies in the sense that even human rights today recognize us only as human bodies, kind of cleansed, reduced from our forms of life. We are only bodies, and he says that it presumes that there are different cultures. There are only bodies and languages. There are only biopolitical formations and cultures at once. This is the way we deal with politics today, and this is also the way we deal with arts. Actually, even taken to the extreme, even the network society taken to the extreme, it necessarily ends in this biopolitical dilemma, because Jody referenced Boltanski and Chiapello's book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, for instance. There they discuss the risk of networking is that at one point people start to commodify one another, start to approach each other only instrumentally. That is, networks can serve as instruments of dehumanization. reducing people to biopolitical subjects. This is even, so visible in networking. But of course, Boltanski, Chiapello would shy away from a radical critique of biopolitics in the context of networking and switch to a kind of reformist sociology, trying to kind of solve the problems of contemporary capitalism within the capitalist framework. But that's the problem of reformist theory. On the other hand, radical philosophy, radical social theory says more than Boltanski and Chiapello or similar theories, I think. Badiou himself adds one bisetting to the maxim of democratic materialism, which says there are only bodies and languages. He corrects, except that there are truths. Truths. This is what cannot be thought of in democratic materialism. Democratic materialism is in the 19th century, Nietzsche called it passive nihilism. What Badiou calls democratic materialism is a society, a life which is devoid of a metaphysical, virtual dimension. This is the problem of politics and aesthetics today. How to speak of truth. How to speak of the dimension of infinity. Biopolitics is about the management of an infinite number of finite bodies, if we use Foucault's language. It would deny the dimension of infinity to both thinking and action in a contemporary world. But how to regain this dimension? That's the philosophical, political problem. Badiou's answer is, for instance, to speak of immortality, fidelity, events in the sense of transcendent cuts in an immanent network society, in an horizontal network society. But there are other answers, which I think the most interesting of which is the Deleuzian answer. There are at least two kinds of events, I think, which are incompatible, but nevertheless need to be thought of together. Badiou's answer, or the philosophy of transcendence, speaks of the event as a vertical intervention to the horizontal plane of immanence, the network society. But Deleuze would, the Deleuzian event, which is both aesthetic and political at once, is an event based on the non-subjective interventions, not necessarily conscious micro-political interventions, but unconscious interventions. So I think these two answers, which we could discuss in detail later, are the two polar, seemingly opposite answers, but which I find annoying in contemporary debate when people, of course there are differences between philosophers of immanence and philosophers of transcendence, but they have a common enemy. This is forgotten very often. Both philosophy of immanence, somebody like Deleuze, or the philosophy of transcendence designate as their number one enemy the ideology I called democratic materialism. They both want kind of immaterial dimension to what exists. What exists cannot be true, as Ernst Bloch has said. I think this is the junction where a lot of problems today emerge. To finish with, I would just like to introduce a topic which I find immensely interesting. If you find it interesting, we could go into its details later. But when we talk about horizon or event or whatever, I think we need to distinguish two specialities, two temporalities from each other neatly. Because the space of the event is not the space of the space of what exists. The event doesn't belong to history. the event doesn't belong to what exists, to the situation automatically. The space of the event is, to use Deleuze's terminology, is the virtual. The virtual, not in the sense of virtual reality in daily life, but the virtual in the philosophical sense, that which comprises everything, the totality of the universe in the Deleuze's terminology, to which everything goes back, from which everything emanates from. This is a very important, I think, concept. Or in ancient Greece, this concept was called kora. When in Plato's dialogues, for example, this concept kora means not spacing, but making it possible to space, giving space to spacing. That's, I think, what we need to think of the event or new horizons. Likewise, the temporality of the event, the temporality of a new horizon is not the chronological temporality of modernity. It's another temporality again, which the ancient Greek called Kairos, which means seizing the moment, apropos the discussion of Lenin before. But seizing the moment, this is Kairos, but mind you, this is only half of the story. Lenin seizes the moment, but he was equally seized by the moment. The day he launched the April thesis, he was called a madman. A Menshevik was shouting from the audience, "You are insane." He was so intoxicated by the idea of revolution, and it was not about only seizing the moment in a strategic sense. He wasn't doing politics as usual. He was equally seized by the moment. This is, I think, the crux of the matter. It's not about talking about revolution or even Marxism or whatever. You know, Jody mentioned David Harvey. I watched him in an interview the other day. He was asked, he was talking about the crisis, etc. He was asked, "Are you a Marxist then?" Then he shies away. "Well, I find Marx useful." Now, this is lack of intoxication. If David Harvey cannot say he's a Marxist, who can say, for God's sake? You know.
That's a tweet.
Just when you read Walter Benjamin's, for instance, a thesis on history, it's all about Kairos. It's all about seizing the moment and being seized by the moment. He has obviously written some preparatory notes to the thesis on history. I found a very strange kind of parenthesis. He talks about politics. We need, he says, we need as much intoxication as political strategy. And then there is a parenthesis. Marx, comma, Nechayev, comma, Dostoevsky. That parenthesis tells everything, I think. That is kind of where aesthetics and politics meet, in the sense of imagining, not only imagining, actually constructing a new horizon. But to end, it's the togetherness of seizing and being seized what makes Kairos Kairos. If the two things are separated, you fall on either side. Seizing the moment without being seized gives us politics as usual, strategic politics. Right, you know, this is what they call in political theory realism. But you can also be seized by without seizing the moment. You can be intoxicated, but will is not enough, as Nietzsche would say. You might be suffering from lack of strategy still. So at one extreme, one gets democratic materialism, I think, strategic politics without intoxication. At the other extreme, one gets seized people, fundamentalists, terrorists, radical nihilists, whatever, who cannot seize the moment. Kind of politics without belief on the one hand, belief without politics. George Bush on the one hand, and Bin Laden on the other hand. But let's not be deceived. I'm not saying George Bush, you know, he is the person who stands probably in the last decade, who stands for the ideology of democratic materialism. But this doesn't mean he doesn't have beliefs. He is intoxicated as well. Then we get layers, over layers, etc. I think this type of thinking, now I don't want to go into the details, but the type of thinking could, I feel, produce results. Here I would like to stop. Thanks.
Do you want to start? I'm going to introduce Wouter Vanstiphout, and then he will present his 20-25 minutes, and then we can shorter. Okay. Wouter Vanstiphout is a historian of architecture and professor of design and politics at the Technical University of Delft in Delft since 2009. Previously, he was visiting professor of geography, landscape, and cities at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna, and professor of architecture and urban planning at Technical University Berlin. Vanstiphout is one of the founders of the Crimson Architectural Historians Research Collective in Rotterdam. He's also a member of the reflection team of VROM, Ministry of Housing, Spatial Planning and the Environment in The Hague, and serves on the board of SCORE, Foundation of Art and Public Space, in Amsterdam. Recent publications include De Collectie, The Collection, Remarkable Train Station Buildings in the Netherlands, which maybe you would like to speak to. The Past, Present and Future of a New Town in 2007. Recent exhibitions with Crimson include Rotterdam, the International Architectural Biennial in Rotterdam, I won't butcher the Dutch, at the Netherlands Architecture Institute in Rotterdam, and the exhibition Wimby at Boymans in Rotterdam as well. And Vanstiphout lives and works in Rotterdam and Schiedam.
Can you hear me? Good. Comrades? Okay. I thought that the story of the metaphor of the free jazz, it made me think of a story about Ornette Coleman. Ornette Coleman, one of the big pioneers of free jazz. In the 70s, he once invited the rock critic Lester Bangs to come on stage with him. And then Lester, he thought that he had this kind of badly misinformed idea that he was a good singer, apart from being a critic. And so he thought that coming on stage with Ornette Coleman meant that he, Lester Bangs, would be able to finally, you know, in music, enter into this dialogue between the critic and the musician and the musicians. But Lester walks on stage and there's this little table standing there with a typewriter. So he gets put behind the typewriter, and then the band starts to play, and then Ornette at a certain point says, okay, now type. And so he has to type like crazy. And then the other musicians try to emulate his typing, but then using the trombone, the drum kit, the bass, etc. And so for the musicians, it was a fantastic experience, they thought, because they entered into a musical dialogue with this strange sound of a rattling typewriter. But Lester Bangs, after that, was extremely disappointed and bitter even, because, of course, nobody knew what he was typing. So I'm not sure what that metaphor means for us, but I'm sure you do. Or you will. Bülent comes from architecture, and then I'm not sure how and why, maybe he kind of goes in a straight line or stumbles into, I don't know, into the world of theory. With me, it's exactly the other way around. I started out as a historian, in a university in the north of the Netherlands. And then with a group of other people, we became kind of intoxicated with the idea of architecture, and not so much the architecture itself, but just this whole scene, you know, these architects presenting their stuff with huge, this was in the early 90s, with these huge carousels of slides under their arms, and just you know, talking about all these projects around the world. And there was this kind of fierce kind of energy, kind of arrogance in a good, in an intoxicating way of architecture, that we as these stupid little historians, you know, that we found really, really interesting. So we basically said, okay, we didn't know how to do architecture, so let's just behave in the way of an architectural office, but then practice history, practice theory. So that's what we did. But then eventually we did stumble through this behavior also into the practice of architecture, and even in the end we even and I'll show some tiny flashes of that into realization. We didn't, not of designs that we made ourselves, but projects that we developed actually as kind of project developers. So that is more or less the history of my office of the last 16, 17 years. And some of the other theory stuff we are doing. This is just to show you a little bit the kind of stuff that I am because I love to be introduced. So Vivian stopped, so I'll just go on and introduce myself a little longer. This is a lecture series we are starting to give now in Delft University, and it's about riots. It's about the relationship that exists between spatial planning, architecture, and also violence and riots and crime, etc. Because it's a relationship that, since the riots in the French banlieue in 2005, there was an enormous amount of journalists, critics, who literally said, this is the legacy of Le Corbusier. This is the legacy of Siam planning. This is the legacy of modernism. And then there were also other journalists and newspaper critics, Christopher Caldwell in the Washington Post, who said, this is the legacy of social democratic planning. This is what you get from big government, riots in the end, because they all happened in public housing. Ergo, public housing means riots. So this idea that large-scale, alienating, modernist, abstract, ideology-based social planning in the end leads to the apocalypse is a subject that we are debating. I'm sorry, in these lectures that more or less it's a kind of forensic research into the exact, really empirical, exact way that these riots developed in the context of their architectural and urban context in Detroit, '67, the British riots in the late 70s and early 80s, the Los Angeles Justice riots, and the riots in Paris. So this is the kind of theory stuff that we still do, and just to show to you how bipolar our office actually is. At the same time, what we also do is we develop projects, and this is, for example, a project that this is highly participatory, highly democratic, and highly, I guess, material. I'm not sure if it's materialist, but it's highly material, this project, because it was built. It's a park that we developed in a kind of very strange coalition between the infrastructure department of the state of the Netherlands, local activist groups, Suriname, hip-hop impresario, etc. And all this stuff came together into a park that we developed. And the interesting thing was, our method in developing it was first telling, to create a kind of story. We did this together with a British office called FAT. Fashion, Architecture, Tastes is what their name stands for. And this is the kind of project, so it literally started out just with that image, that kind of pop artish image up there, and then it kind of developed or degenerated, as some would say, into this piece of reality, this park in the Netherlands. Now, I'm going to skip everything that comes after that for now. This is a project that we are, well, I'll tell you a little bit about this one just to show you that you get a sense of our position. This is a project that we showed at the Rotterdam Biennale last year, and it was a project that was a kind of that was a sort of a criticism, or an alternative, you could say, for the normal way that development happens in cities like Rotterdam, which is you would have an existing area like this, which has grown over the ages, and of course it never became what it should have been, but and it never was used by the people who it was planned for, etc. That's how it goes with cities. And then all of a sudden there's an enormous wave of enthusiasm to build a gigantic new project there, this. And then what happens, what usually happens, is that this existing area, and I'm sure that this is something that is happening in Istanbul too, then once they say this existing area that has, contrary to the original plans or not, developed more or less its own kind of economic logic, its own identity, its own bunch of users, its own layering of functions, etc. Then they say, we will do something here that is much better. What happens then is the whole thing gets demolished and gets replaced by something else. But that means that for years and years and years there's this big black hole in the middle of the city where actually nothing happens. And nothing, which means nothing, which does nothing, etc. So basically what we try to do with a bunch of architects, developers, etc., to see if this could be done in a more in a more incremental way. If the whole idea of incrementalism could be translated into a real viable urban strategy that would produce in the end pieces of city that would not look as if they were produced just like that. That would grow. Now, and here, just before I want to because what I wanted to show you is a little film that we made. This film is a kind of propaganda device. You have to see it like that. This propaganda device is basically a call to, because now I'm really I'm kind of being bogged down, which is a compliment to Bülent, by the remarks that he made before about how for theory the idea of incrementalism, democratic materialism, the hesitation in searching for the big new truths is a big problem, that it is unproductive, this refusal to search for the big truth. And
or small.
Or small one, the truth. It's already so, yeah. And I can relate to that, I understand. But for urban development, the search for the big truth, this kind of permanent creation of, let's all go there. And then, like in the Fellini film, when they see the Virgin Mary appearing, and all the kids, these kids, they are the prophets, and they can see the Virgin Mary appearing all the time. And all the village, each time the kids say, there she's appearing, and then all the village runs that way. And then the kids say, no, she's there, and then the village runs that way. That is something that happens in urban development too. In urban planning, that is exactly what happens. And I think so this constant searching for the big truth, now we know how to do it with our cities. That is one of the most destructive and most terrifying things that you can have. So whereas I imagine, I mean, as a non or maybe ex theory person, I would I would accept that for theory and philosophy, the truth is a fantastic horizon to chase after. For urban planning, it is not. And that is basically the subject of the film that I would like to start now, and it lasts about 10 minutes. Come on. Niet opslaan. How do I get out of these? I just want to go back. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, it's your desktop. It's covered.
Yeah. But where's the film?
It saw the Virgin and it went that way.
Yeah, I know, yeah. I shouldn't have. It was there a minute ago. Does someone still have this USB stick? We could fill the time with talking. I'm
yes,
sure.
I think we should. Bülent.
No, wait, I have it. There it is. Sorry. There we go.
This is a city haunted by the past, nostalgic for the future, and unable to live in the present. Every year, flak lights project a strange form onto the clouds. It is the precise contour of the firestorm that destroyed the city center in the spring of 1940. Why this mass worship of destruction? We gaze up and are collectively transported back to that fateful day when the center of our city was bombed by the German Air Force. Being bombed, our center wiped away from the earth and rebuilt completely in a matter of years, has installed the idea in the inhabitants and politicians of this city that whenever things are not entirely satisfying, its entire physical shape, its ideology, and its identity will be replaced by another one. We do not expect anything from our own traditions, our own knowledge, or our city's existing qualities and identities. We seem torn between a sense of being completely in control of the shape of our city and of our own destiny, and one of being merely an audience, watching the epic of the city's constant changes. Right after the bombing, we looked to the government to provide us with big plans. An entirely new city, the likes of which the world had never seen. We found ourselves in a new world, entirely planned, entirely designed, entirely modern. Its streets and buildings did not even look like streets or buildings. We glided as spirits between the abstract planes and immaterial volumes. Far from the new city center, an even more modern space was being constructed, the port of Rotterdam, the biggest and most modern port in the world. The cosmic scale of the port made clear that for its survival, the city depended on being open. Open to the future, open to the world. But its single-minded modernity allowed the city and its harbor to slowly but surely drift apart. The harbor developed into an artificial landscape inhabited by robotic cranes that pushed uniform boxes around with hardly any help from human beings. The city was no longer essential to the harbor. In the workers' neighborhoods, unemployment, immigration, and low education took their toll on our traditional optimism. Do we really need industry? Do we really need the harbor, the future, the world? Aren't streets places for children to play rather than trucks? Do we even really need the city? Isn't the neighborhood all that counts? Who needs specialists, planners, or technocrats? Isn't the architect's role to listen to us, the people, and turn our wishes into bricks and mortar? Not government, not industry, not economy, but the people's wishes led the city to the shining path of the future. For the people, big plans were abolished. For the people, the neighborhoods were turned into pedestrian communities. For the people, Rotterdam was transformed into a cluster of pre-industrial villages. For the people, the abstract plains and modernist fields of the center were divided into corners, nooks, and crannies. And with the people in mind, only the human scale was allowed to inform space. After some years, disappointment set in. Working for and with the people had degenerated into a bureaucracy of renovation, with mediocrity spread equally throughout the city streets. Architecture and planning had lost all its speculative and even aesthetic energy. The contraction of the city into neighborhoods did nothing for its economy, its image, or its reputation. Was it really in our interest to be comfortably locked up in our pedestrianized neighborhoods and child-friendly streets? Somewhere in the 1980s, the industrial wastelands left by the westward migration of the harbor spawned a new metropolitan enthusiasm, one not seen since the Reconstruction days. While the international architectural avant-garde prepared the groundwork for Rotterdam Architecture City, privatization and deregulation created the need for large objects in which to invest. A magnificently expensive bridge was built as bait for private investment in the former wastelands. After government and the people, the market was now worshipped as the sole savior of our city. We, the people, were replaced by virtual citizens, Photoshop avatars, drinking cappuccinos, enjoying panoramic views, playing golf, or walking our dogs in the thousands of artist impressions of real estate projects. But still, the reality of unemployment, the exacerbated tensions between the Dutch and the immigrants in the impoverished neighborhoods, those residues of the post-industrial economy would not go away. Having deregulated planning and urban policy, the market now introduced a fragmented collection of visionary plans that replaced the crumbling proletarian neighborhoods with beautiful, vibrant urban areas for the metropolitan middle classes. But does designing and even building these neighborhoods miraculously create a wealthy city and root out poverty and unemployment? Katendrecht, a spring afternoon in 2009. A 50-year-old cruise ship is towed into Rotterdam harbor, and thousands of us flock to the quays and bridges to watch its arrival. It looks exactly as it did in 1958. In a desperate attempt to overcome the loss of the coherent city of the Reconstruction, a ghost from our glorious past was conjured up. The steamship. Surely with the return of this symbol, the coherent city of harbor and housing, work and wealth, optimism and openness would finally come into reach. Hundreds of millions had been spent on its restoration. Once docked, it will never move again. Why such extravagant nostalgia? Why so much wishful thinking? Is there a way out of this endless cycle of promise and disappointment? What comes after government? After the people? After the market? Urban reality, in all its ragged glory, is the infinitely complex result of all that came before. There lies the solution. There lies the answer. Out on the streets, in the gutter, beneath the stars. We no longer believe in following ideologies. We believe in creating facts on the ground. Removing physical boundaries, building shared spaces, restoring connections, and revealing unexpected panoramas. This lays the groundwork for an open city. Only when we accept the city as she is right now will we be able to plan her future.
Maybe I could just interject and try to find a way to bring these two positions into dialogue or debate. In part because as I watched this film on the computer here, I was thinking about Bülent Diken's work on the camp, and in particular the way in which you, Bülent, assert that the camp is, or you understand the camp as a non-place in Marc Augé's terms, right? As something that's abstract, non-symbolized. And you assert as well that it's a generalized, I don't want to use the word fact, it's that this camp has been generalized throughout society and has penetrated the entire social field as well as the power relations and the social relations. And that have devolved from it. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit just about your research on the camp, your understanding of the camp, and then maybe take up Wouter's, and this is merely a suggestion, take up Wouter's assertion in this film that that building facts on the ground. I just don't know whether building facts on the ground in a society of non-spaces that has transformed social relations are compatible propositions, and so I wonder if there's a way to bring the two positions into confrontation.
There isn't.
Into confrontation? No. Okay.
I brought a picture, painting by Hopper. I think he's the painter of the camp, so, but I don't know how this works.
Can we have a technician?
Just a minute.
Yeah.
Do you? No, you can't
We're going
see.
to plug it in.
This is how the city looked to painters of city life. Manet's the bar at the Folie Bergère. Here you see kind of a rich urban life from the point of view of the flaneur, the exceptional figure of the 19th century city. I think to understand the camp, we need to move to Hopper, where the distinction between inside and outside disappears. That's the basic definition of the camp. That's fine. Thank you. In the Western mythology, the city is imagined as a space, as an inside. The outside is the space of barbarism, the forests. The city is the place of humanity, the inside. The camp means basically, and I'm following Agamben in this, the disappearance of this distinction between inside and outside. This disappearance coincides with the disappearance of the difference between man and animal, human and animal as well. Because humanity itself is defined as the type of interiority as against the animal. So many spaces in contemporary society are not cities but camps, camps in this sense, but also in a more commonsensical sense. The city is the space of the common good, state property basically. But today in cities what is common is increasingly privatized. The common good is increasingly splintered, as they say, or fragmented, privatized, and kind of marketed and remarketed all the time. So I think the most basic sense of the city is something we have in common. That is disappearing today. Increasingly many spaces are privatized. You know, in Britain, 2-3 million people today pay for their water before they use the water. You know, because they are so poor, the state doesn't provide them with the common good, water, anymore before they pay. They first pay and then use their water. You know, this is not city anymore. This is privatized, and fragmented, splintered city, or the camp. I think at this point I would like to relate to your comments on the destruction the utopias has exerted on cities. Of course, you know, the modernist idea did come to the city as an arsonist. It wasn't kind of a very constructive idea. When Zarathustra comes back to the human's city, to Motley Cow, his gift is fire. You know, he doesn't promise reconstruction of the city. No, fire first. Marxist proletariat is the class that wants to abolish itself in order to abolish the society, change it. Or Nietzsche's nihilist is the man who wants to perish so that he can overcome himself, create oneself anew. This is the idea of revolution, I think. But the point here is not to say this was a bad idea. Violence is an aporetic concept. You never know how much is enough. But you will never know if you don't take the risk. That's the problem. It's not a solution to say, oh, revolutions always lead to totalitarian destruction, etc. Actually, even at the level of the city, capitalism has destroyed much more than utopian ideas. Actually, what we call city planning is an idea that translates Edmund Burke counter-revolution to the level of design, basically. You know, Paris, Haussmann planned, developed the idea of urban planning, basically, to prevent the Paris Commune from happening again. You know, counter-revolution and urban planning are basically, if we stick to Marxist terminology, are basically the same things. My best proof would be, you would know Corbusier's, one of his books has this title, Architecture or Revolution. You know, this is a kind of capitalist blackmail at the level of architecture. That's what we are talking about. So actually, city planning has itself destroyed much more than communist improvisations in the city. And I just wonder how quickly we forget this all the time. You know, even at the level of totalitarianisms, capitalism has destroyed so much more. Why, you know, why to focus on Stalin so much? Because I'm not saying he has done something defensible necessarily. He killed at least the idea of communism. That's the worst thing, his worst crime. But my point is, capitalism is equally destructive, actually, at least. But I would like to connect this idea to the city in another way. Urban planning, I think, has emerged and regenerated itself throughout the centuries, decades, as very inventive a set of ideas to reappropriate what is common. It's a policy-oriented way of appropriating what is common. So the problem of aesthetics and politics at the level of urban planning should be just to do the opposite. How can the city become a common place? Again, that's the question. And I'm afraid you can't do this. You can't do this peacefully only. It's not. It might be possible, but there is no guarantee. You know, if you want something new, a new horizon would not come by itself peacefully. It might, but there is no guarantee. Who was talking about birds? Aldous Huxley talks about this strange bird, dodo. I don't know if everybody, you know, the bird which is not a bird really. We shouldn't reduce the idea of politics or aesthetics to a kind of dodoism, which is or kind of decaf innovations, which will not cost us anything. There is always a risky aphoretic element in the new. There is no experiment that is free. This applies to urban planning as well. I'm really happy to defend Russian constructivists or deconstructivist architects today, or why not? They are much better than Haussmann and his followers, aren't they?
Yeah. Which one shall I use? This one is. Does this one work? Yeah. Okay. I follow my mouth. Okay. I have to follow my mouth when I'm speaking. I completely agree, I'm afraid. One of the things that we try to also put across with this film, it kind of glanced by, is that, but it's something that has been bothering us for quite a while, it's that in this analysis, this consensus nearly, that modernist planning of the 50s and 60s is responsible for so many social evils, then the idea behind that consensus is, why is it responsible for those evils? Because it assumed that it could completely, out of a utopian intoxication, completely recreate society, and that was a bad idea, and that is the root cause, the original sin, why modernist housing estates are nearly universally problematic areas. There's a kind of consensus about that with the people in power, basically. But the funny thing is, what they then do is use that consensus in order to say, okay, let's demolish them. Let's just demolish all of them. We'll demolish them, we'll replace them by Haussmann type or suburban type urban forms that in the past have proved that they are not problematic. So the interesting thing is, while the current many city planners, many policy makers say that we have to demolish these areas because the architects thought that by designing the world in a certain way, by building the world in a certain way, it will also behave in a certain way, and that was a mistake. They are now demolishing the city because they believe that the demolition of the city will actually help, will actually create the better society. So the interesting thing is, while on a kind of theoretical or philosophical or let's say conceptual level, it is absolutely true that the modernist housing estates were built on a fallacy, on something that I could hardly defend myself now. If you would directly make a straight line from realizing that they were built on a kind of a theoretical swamp, on that if you would directly translate the theoretical of that into saying, so we should demolish them, then you are doing exactly the same as those guys were doing in the 50s and 60s themselves, and you are being extremely destructive, because one of the things that we realize, and that's where also the work of what Bülent did in the 90s, I think in a spectacular modernist housing estate near Aarhus, Gellerup. That is that is one of the reasons that I got to know his work, because he was one of the only people then writing about what was really going on in these areas, and trying to understand these areas as they actually were, instead of looking at them in the way of what they should be. Because this looking at the world in terms of what it should be instead of what it is one of the most destructive factors for, at least for the professions that I am active in. Maybe not for your profession, but it is for the profession of city planning and policy making.
I think what is happening today is with the increasing securitization of cities, we are getting the camp as terror. Let's call it by its name. Terror is not only something the terrorists do. Actually, it is used as a design element in urban transformation today. I would like to give an example. This is how a bench used to look as part of an urban environment. This is how a bomb-proof bench, as Mike Davis would call, looks today. But my point is, this is no longer the case Mike Davis was talking about in the 90s. He was taking pictures like this to discuss how homeless people are kept away from shopping malls, etc., by making it impossible for them to sleep on these benches. My point is that exception has become the rule, in the sense that these technologies, design elements, are not used for the undesirables like the homeless only anymore. They are used for everybody. It has, this type of design has become a dispositive in the perfect Foucauldian sense, an instrument of producing new truths, redefining the whole of the social life, basically. What is interesting in this bench, if we use the old notions like Foucault's disciplinary power, for example, in this bench there is a clear element of discipline in the perfect Foucauldian sense. It teaches somebody how to use one's body in a social context. But it is also an instrument of control in the Deleuzian sense. Its philosophy is based on the notion of mobility. It says, move on, don't sit here too long. It's an instrument of control in the sense that it urges further mobility rather than immobile, disciplinary positioning of the subject. But one could go further. With Baudrillard, for example, when he went to America already in the 80s, he said there are three dimensions of transpolitics, his name for what I call democratic materialism today. There are three elements of this: obesity, the second was, the third one was terror. His point was, he's a methodological extremist. What he does is to take what Foucault has said, what Deleuze has said to their extremes. He says, actually, terror is part of transpolitics in the sense that even car design is even gated communities, etc., are designed according to this principle. This is a terrorist bench in that sense. What does a terrorist do? He destroys himself in order to destroy the sociality around him. This bench, this is not a bench anymore. It's the self-destruction of the bench through design. Basically, it destroys itself in order to destroy a type of sociality around it. It is, I think, a concrete image of what terror as a dispositive is.
Can I just
today.
see, before we have about 10 more minutes, and I'd like to find out if anyone in the audience has a question that you feel you would like to ask at the moment? Yeah. So now we can use this mic.
Hello, my name is Alex de Vries. I'm an author and a board member of BAC. I'm getting the impression that architecture is now presented as a crime against humanity. And is there something more ideological, optimistic approach towards architecture, for instance, to you, Wouter, because you were so impressed when you were still a theorist by the architect, or did you come to your senses?
You just gave yourself away there. No. I'm still impressed. You know, the interesting thing of architects is that they have to deal with the world with a combination of, on the one hand, ignorance, because they get asked by, like, can you produce in 2 weeks a competition design for a new town near Shanghai? And they have never been there before, they don't know the people who they are working for, they have no idea what the conditions of the ground are, etc. And they say, yes, we can. You know, so it's a kind of a combination of ignorance and arrogance that drives this profession, and I love that. I think it is beautiful, and of course it makes them run into trouble all the time, etc. But it also does exactly what Bülent called for. You know, if you don't risk something, you will never have something. So on the one hand, I absolutely, that is one thing that I really love about architecture. And on the other, because it's that model, but then all the time, every day, for real. And it's a way, of course, I'm in it in an ambivalent way. Another term I learned from Bülent. Because on the one hand we are still, you know, like genetically we are still observers, theorists. On the other hand we are taking part. But I love this. It's a wonderful way to get to know the world, more or less, by all the time crashing into it with all your arrogance and ignorance. So it brings out, looking at the world through the architectural problems it has. Is for me still an intoxicating thing. On the other hand, there's one thing I wanted to add, just to bring you up to speed on the completely perverse ways that sometimes theory and architecture interact. Of course, a book that you all know very well, I'm sure, is the Network Society by Castells. Now, that book made a huge impression in architecture society, in the architecture scene. A huge impression. Architects now we architects, we have created the consensus that the city does not exist anymore. We have the Network Society. And this, you can see it being used, that whenever you try to talk in architecture world about creating public space, about creating shared spaces, about if you think about a neighborhood that maybe you would have, for example, a primary school there, things like that. To think about the neighborhood as a kind of in a vertical way, you know, that you have a layering of different things there. Then a kind of knee-jerk response from planners and architects is, no, that's not how the city is used anymore. Read Castells. The city is used as a network. So we do not need to make these complete urban areas anymore. We do not need to work on that anymore. We have other problems, the nodes, the lines, the tangents, etc. So, you know, that's an interesting way of, while in theory these things are in the theory world, these things are being described, but then, you know, then in the architecture world they say, hey, they offered us a new concept, let's work with that. So there's a really strange, perverse relationship sometimes between the worlds of theory and the worlds of architecture. I'm sure that Beatrice Colomina can also talk a lot about that. I'm not sure if she's here, but I'm just saying that.
Şimdi ben Türkçe konuşacağım için.
Can you wait 1 second? We put our headphones.
I will speak Turkish, so.
Yep.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. How do I? Thanks.
Go ahead.
Şimdi sorumu sormadan önce bir açıklama yapmak istiyorum. Yani şöyle bir gelecek gözüküyor. Tam istihdamdan artık herhalde kimse bahsetmiyor dünyada. Çünkü otomasyon ve bunun sonucunda işsiz kalan insanlar, buna eklenen tabi bu işsiz kalanlarla birlikte satın alma gücünün düşmesi ve daha fazla işten çıkarma ya da bölgesel olarak ucuz iş gücüne doğru bir kayma nedeniyle metropollerde herhalde önümüzdeki dönemdeki en büyük sorunlardan biri bu olabilir diye düşünüyorum. Yani metropolün merkezi ve çevresi, varoş diye denebilir işte. Yani çeşitli şeyler verilebilir. Şimdi bu tabii Avrupa'daki kentlerin çoğunda henüz gündeme gelmedi. Görünür değil. Ama belki Paris var işte benim bile bildiğim. Diğerlerini bilmiyorum. Doğrusunu söylemek lazım ama geldiğimiz zaman işte Mexico City, Rio vesaire işte İstanbul, İzmir, Adana, Diyarbakır bunları böyle saydığımız zaman merkezde 1/3 nüfusun yaşadığını, 2/3'nin de çevrede yaşadığını görüyoruz. Şimdi bu insanlar açısından planlama çok büyük bir sorun. Birinci sorun, o planlama onlara bir kere sorulamıyor da ayrıca. Çok enteresan bir nokta bu. Yani soramıyorsunuz maalesef. Böyle bir durum var. Onların estetik anlayışları da farklı. Yani estetik de göreceli bir şey. Orada 2/3 nüfus diyor ki ben yani o mimarların ya da planlamacıların planladığı estetiği ya da konsepti kabul etmeme ihtimali var. Şimdi böyle bir durumda ne çözüm öneriyorsunuz?
Bülent, could you?
Yeah, I can.
Can you
Can
just?
I-
I couldn't. My headset isn't working. Could you also just tell us what he asked for the
Oh,
people
no.
who don't have headphones? No,
I can.
you can.
You're welcome.
You can too. I mean, maybe
I just want
I'm
to
dependent on the translator. So you
No,
have it straight from the
I would
man's
like
mouth.
to answer, but
But we need to know. I don't.
You know
the
what?
question.
I'll ask it as a question to you.
was it a question to me?
I think there are two very short things. First, the gentleman says, in the future there will not be full employment. Oh, I'm sorry. In the future there will not be full employment. So how do we deal with that? I'm shortening it. Huh? And the other thing is, in order to have this to recreate a kind of, well, to manage the relationships between the center and the periphery, which exists, for example, in cities like Paris, and here, of course, in this area is much more complicated. There needs to be a kind of overall view on the city as a whole, on which the people who live in the periphery and the people in the suburbs can never agree, because they both have their own aesthetic expectations, but of course also their completely different interests. So how do we create a kind of, and this is a really interesting question, I think, very difficult. How can we again think in terms of the large scale, the master plan, I don't know, the kind of regional vision on the city, and that involves all the polar opposites of the interests of the people who live it?
Thanks. Planning policy issues are very important, of course, but I'm not here to talk about policy. I'm talking about the planning philosophy, not the policy, but politics of planning. This is kind of the point of the debate for me, and I'm happy to discuss those issues. And I believe there is need for planning. But before then, before doing planning, we need to discuss the philosophy of planning as such. That's my problematic here. Of course, the future, but I'm a sociologist, I'm not a prophet. I don't know what the future will bring. I hope it brings some events as well as more of the same. But my point here, I think, is also to say that the future has become the present. Simon was talking about it yesterday. Actually, what is really interesting today is to read the old utopias like Brave New World, for example. We are in a way already living in Brave New World now. You know, think about the two maxims of Huxley's Brave New World. The first, everybody is happy now. This is democratic materialism. Everybody is happy now. What's time for? Lenin asks. What's time for? What's the use of time? That is, what's the use of events? What's the use of new horizons? This was the nightmare for Huxley. This is our reality today. This is exactly what we've been talking about. What's the second maxim of Brave New World? Everyone belongs to everyone else. This is network society, isn't it? You know, Huxley's Brave New World is no longer the future. I think this was Simon's point in his presentation yesterday. I think that this has some political significance. So instead of imagining we will be in a future, we should also kind of turn the idea upside down and kind of rethink the present as yesterday's future, as yesterday's utopia, or even worse, yesterday's dystopias, I think. Thanks.
We're out of time, but I hope that you will join me in thanking Wouter Vanstiphout and Bülent Diken for the conversation, and I encourage you to try to speak with them immediately after the Congress if you have any further questions. We're going to need about 3 or 4 minutes to do some sort of technical shifting and to get set up for the next conversation between Vanstiphout and Lisette Lanialo. Okay?